This isn't just another conversation for clicks. It's a quiet confrontation with something we're all noticing, but few want to name. Is being depressed just a trend now? Somewhere along the way, the language of real suffering became a costume, something people try on for attention, aesthetic, or social currency. But when we blur the line between performance and pain, the ones who truly need help get drowned out. So if this topic speaks to something you've been thinking about or feeling, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more conversations that actually matter, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Let's not just consume content, let's start reflecting deeply together. There was a time when people used to whisper about mental health, not out of disrespect, but out of reverence. Depression wasn't a word passed around in casual conversation. It was a shadow in someone's life approached with care, not commentary. But today, it's loud, strangely loud. It echoes in bio captions, trends, hashtags, moods of the week. What once was a silent scream is now a curated aesthetic. And while the noise might seem like progress, we have to ask, is it really awareness, or has empathy become performative? There's a new kind of attention forming around mental health, not from understanding but from visibility. And visibility is powerful, but when we begin to associate depression with soft music and sad selfies, with dim lighting and poetic captions, we cross a subtle, dangerous line. Because now suffering has a look, it has an algorithm, it has marketing value. The truth of it gets blurred in edits, softened by filters, and romanticized until it no longer resembles what it actually is: devastating, paralyzing, and unglamorous. And that's the wound this trend is leaving behind. When we start treating pain as content, we take away its weight. Empathy becomes applause. It's no longer about who's hurting, just about who's being seen. And the more people get rewarded for being seen as broken, the more the brokenness is exaggerated, or worse, invented. Depression becomes fashionable. It becomes something to emulate rather than understand. But real mental illness doesn't care about aesthetics. It's not poetic. It's not curated. It's raw, and often invisible. People now say they're depressed because they didn't get enough likes, or because it's Monday, or because they didn't get the right coffee order. And while those moments are frustrating, they're not clinical depression, they're not chemical imbalances, they're not days you lose track of yourself entirely, or mornings where getting out of bed feels like dragging your soul through cement. Yet, the language has been flattened. We've taken a serious condition and melted it down into a vibe, a meme, a joke, a t-shirt slogan. This cultural shift might feel harmless to some, but to those actually living with depression, it's not. Because what happens when everything looks like depression, but nothing feels like it? When you finally build up the courage to speak about your pain, but people have already grown numb to the language, you get dismissed. You get told you're just being dramatic, or just having a bad day. That dismissal doesn't come from malice, it comes from desensitization. And that desensitization is directly fueled by this rising aesthetic of sadness. The people faking it for likes, for validation, for brand alignment, they aren't always doing it maliciously. Sometimes it's subconscious. It feels like connection. It feels like community. But we need to understand that just because something feels relatable doesn't mean it's real. And just because people are responding doesn't mean they understand. True empathy doesn't look like likes and shares. It looks like listening without needing to be heard back. It looks like sitting beside someone in silence, not retweeting their pain with a caption that rhymes. We're entering an era where the louder you cry online, the more you're rewarded, and slowly people learn that vulnerability sells. They start showing sadness not as a means to heal, but as a means to gain. This is how the culture of trend-based empathy thrives, not in healing wounds, but in showcasing them, in keeping them open, in turning scars into centerpieces. It's the kind of attention that never wants you to get better, because healing doesn't trend. Hope isn't as clickable as heartbreak. But what this does is far worse than misrepresenting mental illness. It steals the microphone from the ones who really need it. The ones who aren't crying online because they don't have the strength to type. The ones who aren't making videos because getting through the next 10 minutes is their only goal. When depression becomes a character people play, the real sufferers become background noise. And we must ask ourselves, what kind of society are we becoming, where pretending to suffer is more beneficial than actually healing? This isn't about gatekeeping pain, it's about protecting its meaning. Real mental health awareness is about more than posts. It's about practice. It's not just about saying check on your friends, it's about doing it. It's not about wearing black on Mental Health Awareness Day, It's about creating a world where people don't have to wear masks for the other 364 days. We must raise our standards for what we call advocacy. If your sadness is a prop, take it down. If your empathy is performative, pause it. Because every time someone fakes a mental illness for aesthetics or validation, it pushes the real ones deeper into silence. And silence is where mental illness thrives. Let's return to a place where compassion doesn't need a spotlight. Where being mentally well isn't the default for being ignored, and being mentally ill isn't the golden ticket for attention. Let us build a culture where healing is honored, not hidden, and pain is understood, not imitated. Because if we continue to blur the lines between appearance and affliction, the very definition of depression will dissolve, and when someone finally calls for help, we won't hear them at all. Just because we all experience sadness, doesn't mean we are clinically depressed. That truth is slowly slipping through the cracks, as society increasingly trades in emotional vocabulary for catchphrases. "I'm so depressed" has become shorthand for disappointment, boredom, or even just a bad day. We've started using clinical terms as emotional accessories, detached from their actual weight. But clinical depression is not just feeling low, it's an unrelenting physical, psychological erosion of self. It's not mood swings, it's a chemical lockdown on joy. And yet pop culture doesn't always make that distinction. We've grown used to consuming feelings the same way we consume fashion: fast, unverified and viral. When everyone online seems to be going through something deep, we begin to mirror those expressions, not always because we feel them, but because they feel familiar. The more we see people cry on camera, post about trauma, or wear their breakdowns like badges, the more those performances start shaping what we think is normal. But relatability is not reality. This blurring of lines is not just careless, it's dangerous. Because when sadness is marketed as depression, we begin to invalidate the complexity of both. We forget that sadness is a necessary human response, healthy, even. It tells us something is off, or needs change. It's situational, it passes. Depression, on the other hand, doesn't ask for a reason. It arrives without warning and overstays. Even when life looks fine from the outside, a person can be surrounded by love, success, opportunity, and still feel like they are drowning in the absence of hope. So when the world treats sadness and depression as interchangeable, it causes confusion not only among those observing, but within the sufferer themselves. A teenager may think their recurring bad moods are a diagnosis. Someone grieving may mistake their sorrow for illness, and someone truly ill may not even realize it, because they don't look like the dramatic, overdone version of depression they've seen on screen. This isn't just a failure of semantics, it's a collapse of understanding. You cannot treat an illness you don't recognize, and you won't recognize it if you've been taught to believe it should look like crying every day, wearing dark clothes, or posting long captions about emptiness. Depression can be high functioning. It can wear lipstick, it can smile at parties, it can show up at work on time. And the truth is, some of the most depressed people are the ones who will never say it out loud. So the moment we paint depression with one narrow brush, we begin erasing countless silent stories. The current culture thrives on resonance. We share things because they hit, and while resonance builds connection, it also builds distortion when used without discernment. When influencers casually throw around statements like "my depression is killing me," without a trace of reflection or context, those words start losing their sacred weight. Depression becomes just another caption to dress up a moody photo, and the more we use the language of illness to describe ordinary emotions, the harder it becomes to hear the cries of those who are genuinely suffering. There's also something deeply ironic about pretending to be unwell just to be seen, because what that reveals is a hunger for belonging, a cry for attention rooted not in malice but in disconnection. But here's the truth: you don't need to fake pain to deserve compassion. You don't have to borrow suffering to be part of the conversation. We need to normalize being okay. We need to make space for people who want to support mental health without needing to perform it. This shift in how we describe our feelings must start with language. We need to be more intentional with our words. Let sadness be sadness. Let stress be stress. Let depression be a medical condition that demands respect, nuance, and informed discussion. Language is the first step in reclaiming mental clarity, because how we speak shapes how we see. As we move forward, let's ask ourselves why we feel compelled to amplify or imitate pain. Are we doing it for attention, for relevance, for identity? If the answer is yes, that doesn't make us evil, but it does make us responsible, because in this climate, where visibility is currency, we must remember that not everything needs to be broadcast to be valid. And not every feeling needs to be pathologized to be worthy of care. There's deep strength in honesty, saying I'm just tired when you're just tired, saying I'm frustrated instead of I'm spiraling. We must relearn the emotional spectrum without rushing to the extremes. That's where healing begins, in the space where clarity returns, where words carry weight again, where support is given to those who truly need it, and where being okay is no longer seen as boring or cold. When we honor truth over trend, we begin to repair the broken narrative, not with silence, not with shame, but with deliberate awareness. The world doesn't need more declarations of pain for popularity. It needs quiet, consistent efforts to protect those who can't scream loud enough to be heard. And that begins with us, choosing to listen more carefully, speak more thoughtfully, and never mistake performance for presence. We're seeing it everywhere now, on social feeds, in films, on shirts and coffee mugs. This aesthetic of brokenness. The sad girl with smeared eyeliner, the lonely boy staring out of a rain-soaked window, dark rooms, cryptic captions, playlists soaked in grief. And yet, something feels off. Because this isn't pain as it is lived, it's pain as it is curated, a stylized, filtered version of despair made to look almost beautiful. But real depression is never beautiful. It's hollow. It drains color, not add moody palettes. It doesn't show up in perfectly timed videos with sad piano music playing in the background. It shows up uninvited at 3 a.m. with a weight on your chest that makes breathing feel like labor. And yet, this trend we're seeing makes it seem as though suffering is a badge of identity, a soft rebellion, a vibe. That's dangerous. Because when we romanticize despair, we're not just misrepresenting mental illness, we're dressing it up as something desirable. And when sadness becomes attractive, there's always someone who will chase it, hoping it makes them more interesting, more artistic, more seen. That's the cost of packaging pain for mass consumption. It tempts the emotionally healthy to mimic symptoms they don't actually feel, just to fit in. But you don't need to perform brokenness to be profound. You don't need to drown in darkness to be deep. The lie we're being sold is that melancholy is the highest form of self-awareness, that if you're not depressed, you're just shallow. But let's be honest. True awareness isn't always heavy. True growth often lives in clarity, not confusion. And no, you're not weak for wanting to be okay. When depression is repackaged into soft-lit sadness and made to look poetic, we unintentionally set a cultural standard where health is boring and pain is appealing. Young people start feeling like their well-being disqualifies them from belonging to the conversation. And that's tragic, because healing, stability, hope, these are not dull things. They are radical. In a world drowning in curated misery, joy is rebellion. But right now, we're stuck in this loop where the illusion of despair gets more attention than the reality of it. A cryptic post about numbness can rack up likes, while a quiet person genuinely struggling is met with silence. We've created a system that rewards the performance of pain, not the presence of it. That's not advocacy. That's exploitation of a wound that doesn't belong to you. And the worst part, it's making people who are actually battling depression feel invisible. Because when sadness becomes everyone's aesthetic, the real sufferers can't compete. They're not photogenic in their grief. They're not poetic in their silence. They're just trying to survive, one breath at a time. They're not crying in front of mirrors for reels. They're curled up on bathroom floors, hoping the next hour feels different from the last. We owe them better. We owe them a culture that sees them. Not a culture that parades despair like a costume to be worn during October and discarded by New Year. We need to stop telling people that pain is more honest than peace, because peace is real, recovery is real, and those who fight every day to reach it deserve more than to be sidelined by someone else's curated tragedy. It's time to reclaim the seriousness of what depression actually is. It's not edgy, it's not cute, it's not a filter you apply and remove at will. It's the silent disintegration of self. It's the long days that feel like years. It's forgetting the sound of your own laughter. And if you haven't known that abyss, be grateful, but don't borrow its aesthetic to look profound. And if you have, if you know that darkness, then you know how much it cheapens your journey when others imitate the outer shell without facing the inner storm. There is no poetry in pretending. There is no strength in wearing chains you can take off whenever it suits your narrative. Mental illness isn't a personality trait. It's not a branding tool, it's a fight. And for many, it's lifelong. So instead of stylizing suffering, what if we glorified the small quiet victories? What if we made healing the trend? What if showing up, staying soft, choosing hope? What if those things became the new aesthetic, not just because they look good on a screen, but because they reflect real inner work? That shift in value is long overdue, because right now too many people are drowning in silence while the noise gets all the attention. Too many are afraid to ask for help because they don't want to be accused of faking it like the others. Too many have lost faith in the language of struggle because it's been co-opted, exaggerated, diluted. We cannot build a better future for mental health if the conversation is led by those who wear pain like a costume and discard it when it stops performing. We must center the real, the raw, the honest, not the curated illusion, because those who are actually depressed are not posting sad songs every night. They're fighting to get out of bed. They're not trying to look broken. They're trying to find a way back to wholeness. And that journey, that quiet, powerful, unseen journey, deserves our deepest respect. And then it gets quieter for the ones who are truly struggling. You'd think that as mental health awareness grows, so would the volume of those silently fighting for their lives. But somehow the opposite is happening. Because in a room full of people shouting "Me too," it becomes harder to notice the ones who barely have the strength to whisper it. People are performing pain now, and not just performing it, but marketing it, stylizing it, building personalities around it. And when a performance gets loud enough, the ones who are actually hurting get pushed to the back of the stage, not because their pain is less valid, but because it's less visible, less polished, less tweetable, less convenient. Real depression doesn't trend, it doesn't post well, it doesn't fit into a clean Instagram carousel or a TikTok with soft background music. The real thing often looks like unread messages, cancelled plans, dishes piling up, a body that forgets how to move, a brain that forgets how to want. But that version isn't celebrated, it's not marketable, so we start seeing louder voices take over. People who've never felt the paralyzing weight of mental illness begin to speak for those who live under it every day. They take the mic with a shaky voice, pretending it's their own, and the world, craving a palatable version of pain, listens. It's a strange kind of theft, really, not the kind you can catch with your eyes, but the kind you feel in your bones. When you see someone casually claim depression to justify avoidance, to excuse toxicity, to curate an image, they don't realize they're drowning out someone else's cry for help. They don't hear the silence that follows after their post goes viral, because someone out there who was about to speak up now questions whether they'll be taken seriously. That silence is dangerous. It's not passive, it's choking. When genuine sufferers start thinking, will they believe me? Or will they just assume I want attention too? We've already failed. We've built a culture where pretending to be sick is easier than being honest about the sickness. And in that shift we've made empathy harder to access. We've taught the world to doubt before it listens. We've forced people to perform their pain instead of express it. And it goes deeper than just social consequences. When you fake mental illness for attention, you're not just misrepresenting yourself, you're actively shaping a societal narrative. You're rewriting what depression looks like in the public imagination. You're telling the world, this is what struggling looks like, and the world believes you. And then when someone comes forward with the real thing, when it's messy, inconvenient or terrifying, it doesn't register. People say, but that doesn't look like depression, because you've shown them a version that was rehearsed. We are not just dealing with fakers, we're dealing with erasers. People who erase the texture, the complexity, the quiet hell of mental illness and replace it with something easier to digest, something lighter, something they can post. And while they get the likes, the actual sufferers get the doubt, the questions, the rolled eyes, the misdiagnoses, the delays in help, the misplaced jokes, and most tragically, the loneliness. There are people right now who won't speak up about their suicidal thoughts because they don't want to be lumped in with those who weaponize mental health for sympathy. That's not paranoia. That's a learned response from seeing how the world now treats these conversations. It's the fear of being seen as dramatic, manipulative, or worse, attention-seeking. So they say nothing. They swallow their truth. They quiet themselves so someone else can keep performing their fiction. And we let it happen because it feels harmless. Because we think, maybe they're just expressing themselves, or at least we're talking about mental health. But awareness that's built on inauthenticity is a house of mirrors. It reflects back what we want to see, not what's really there. It traps people in illusions, and in those illusions, the truly broken suffer in silence while the echo chamber gets louder. We must reclaim that silence, not by silencing others, but by returning the mic to those whose stories were never trendy to begin with, by refusing to amplify false narratives, by choosing discernment over virality. Real awareness is not loud, it's intentional, it's uncomfortable, it doesn't always go viral, but it changes lives. And the change begins by realizing that not every sad face is in pain, and not every smiling one is safe. It begins when we decide to stop rewarding performative pain, and start listening for the ones who aren't even sure how to describe theirs. Because underneath the noise, there's someone whose silence is screaming, not for likes, not for shares, not for branding, but for help. And we need to be the kind of people who can hear that scream before it disappears entirely. And when we finally start to listen again, really listen, we'll hear something else too. How often that scream has been turned into a joke. How the weight of real mental illness has become a meme. How we've mistaken empathy for engagement. How we've begun to treat depression not as an illness but as an identity badge. That is where we go next. Into the uncomfortable truth that our culture doesn't know how to help without turning help into content. Into the truth that too many people now wear sadness like an accessory, easy to put on, easy to take off. But somewhere along the line, we started mistaking validation for healing. In a culture addicted to attention, sadness became currency. Some people discovered that confessing to mental distress, or more accurately, performing it, could bring something that felt like comfort. Likes, messages, retweets. "We're here for you" comments from strangers they barely knew. Suddenly, a vague caption about being mentally drained became more than a cry for help. It became a shortcut to intimacy, a signal for sympathy, an easy way to feel seen without needing to be real. This isn't about questioning anyone's pain, but it's about something deeper, something more delicate. The difference between pain that seeks healing and pain that seeks attention. The former is raw, silent, and often hidden in plain sight. The latter is curated, conveniently timed, and disturbingly hollow, because real depression doesn't always look poetic. It's not a perfectly framed mirror selfie with teary eyes. It's lying face down on the floor in clothes you haven't changed in days, unable to cry at all. It's missing messages, cancelling plans, sleeping through sunlight, and waking up with shame. It's invisible most of the time, quiet in ways that don't trend. Yet the performance of pain has become profitable. We've made it so easy, even rewarding, to posture as unwell that it's hard to tell who's actually drowning and who's just mimicking the motion. And in this theater of suffering, the ones who are genuinely struggling start to fall through the cracks. Their voices get buried under louder, flashier imitations of sadness. There is nothing more painful for someone battling real depression than being viewed with suspicion. But that's exactly what happens when false cries for help flood the room. People begin to assume that everyone is exaggerating. They stop listening carefully. They hesitate before offering support. They harden. And who can blame them? The air has been poisoned with insincerity. When we allow sympathy to become a currency, we cheapen it. And the people who once depended on it, who need that compassion to survive another day, find it less available, more guarded, more skeptical. It's like flooding a village with counterfeit money. The economy breaks down, and even the ones who had real needs can no longer access what they used to rely on. What's worse is that this performance becomes self-fulfilling. The person pretending to be depressed for attention may eventually find themselves trapped in a role they can't exit. They curate a digital identity around fragility, and soon, any sign of joy or stability feels like betrayal to the audience they've built. So they remain in character, not necessarily because they're in pain, but because they're afraid of being called a fraud. This isn't healing, it's psychological entrapment, and the echo chamber only grows louder. This doesn't mean we should become cold. It doesn't mean we stop listening, or harden ourselves against people's vulnerability. But discernment is not cruelty. Compassion needs boundaries, just like love does. If we don't protect the space of real mental health dialogue, it becomes a stage for manipulation rather than a sanctuary for honesty. Because this isn't a game. Depression is not a brand. Mental illness is not a storyline to soft launch for aesthetic appeal. It's a deeply personal, often terrifying experience that requires medical care, emotional support, and time. Treating it like a shortcut to engagement not only disrespects the people who are truly suffering, it warps the entire framework through which society understands mental health. And here's the ripple effect we don't talk about enough. The person silently fighting for their life behind a smile begins to believe they must also dramatize their pain to be taken seriously. They start to wonder, am I not broken enough for help? Or do I need to post something darker for people to notice? This subtle pressure pushes them further into isolation, into silence, or worse, into self-destructive choices just to feel valid. And that right there is the real tragedy. We must return to truth, not performative vulnerability, not curated sadness, but truth, raw, unfiltered, unshareable in a caption. We must reteach ourselves that it's okay not to be okay, even if nobody sees it. That healing is a personal, often invisible journey, not a social display, and that the people who are actually unwell deserve to be the center of the conversation, not pushed to the periphery by a trending aesthetic. This moment, this cultural crossroads, asks us to be honest with ourselves. Are we seeking help or spotlight? Are we supporting others, or centering ourselves in their pain? Are we using empathy, or abusing it for applause? Because in a world where mental illness becomes a costume, we start forgetting what real wounds look like. And if we forget that, if we can no longer recognize the cries behind closed doors, then we are not building a more understanding society. We are building a colder, louder one, and eventually, even the loudest cries will go unheard. We live in a time where humor is the default coping mechanism, and pain has been converted into punchlines. Mental health conversations, once sacred and hushed, are now repackaged into viral formats, sharp-witted tweets, aesthetic Instagram, infographics, looping reels filled with quirky sadness. We laugh, we nod, we relate, but somewhere along the scroll, we start to confuse recognition with remedy. And that's the danger, because no matter how many times you repost that depression feels like this meme, healing never arrives as a joke. When the collective language of healing becomes ironic, when sadness becomes satire, the very real weight of mental illness begins to feel like something we're supposed to giggle through, as if depression is something that can be processed through likes, managed by retweets, softened by snappy captions. We convince ourselves that if others are laughing too, then maybe it's not that deep. Maybe this darkness is just another shared experience, casually acknowledged and then moved past with an emoji. But here's the truth. Memes might feel like mirrors, but they rarely show the whole reflection. They're fractured glass, funny in fragments, but deeply dangerous when mistaken for the full picture. The problem isn't the humor. Humor has always been a survival mechanism. What's harmful is when the humor becomes the only conversation, when the content replaces the context, when someone in pain watches the world laugh at the very symptoms that make them want to disappear, and wonders if they're supposed to find it funny too. That kind of cultural response turns personal battles into entertainment. It creates a social environment where expressing struggle is only acceptable if it's palatable, if it's shareable, if it's cute enough to fit into a 15-second clip with lo-fi music playing softly in the background. And while the internet tells us you're not alone, there's a difference between feeling seen and being healed. Liking a post that says "I don't want to exist today" might give a fleeting sense of connection, but it doesn't provide tools. It doesn't offer structure. It doesn't hold your hand when the intrusive thoughts are louder than logic. It doesn't help you choose to stay. We must recognize that true healing doesn't exist in pixels. It exists in practices, in systems, in support that goes far beyond recognition. Because here's what happens when memes become the medicine. People stop seeking the real thing. They begin to believe that if their experience is being echoed by thousands online, then maybe this is just how life is now. Maybe feeling this way all the time is normal. Maybe they don't need to talk to someone. Maybe they don't need help. And that lie becomes a slow poison. It steals years. It numbs futures. It tells a generation that coping is the same thing as recovering. And that is one of the most harmful myths we've ever sold. And while all this noise builds, the quiet voices, those who are truly suffering, start to fall further behind. They begin to feel invalidated by the performative sadness around them. Their pain is not cinematic. It's not funny. It doesn't fit neatly into a template. It is raw, and messy, and hard to articulate. And when all they see is a world laughing through darkness, they wonder if their darkness is even worth acknowledging, or worse, if acknowledging it would just be met with silence. Because in a culture addicted to amusement, raw vulnerability can feel out of place. We're shaping a world where people are more likely to post about depression than to ask for help with it, where therapy becomes a trend and not a tool, where the depth of emotional suffering is reduced to aesthetic sadness. We cannot keep replacing recovery with relatability. We cannot keep mistaking views for validation. The truth is, memes aren't medicine, and they were never meant to be. Medicine is quiet. It's slow. It's not always pretty. It looks like commitment, like showing up to therapy when you don't feel like talking, like taking your meds even when you feel like they're not doing anything, like building habits that no one claps for. That's the real work. And no one is going viral for it. But that's okay, because we don't need our healing to be visible. We just need it to be real. If we want to see a culture that truly supports mental health, we must create space for unfiltered pain and unglamorous recovery. We must remind people that while humor can be a doorway, it is not the destination, that it's okay to laugh, but it's also okay to cry, to rage, to ask for help without a punchline. And from this place of clarity, we can begin to shift, to peel back the aesthetic and honor the ache, to speak with depth in a world trained to skim, to remind ourselves that sadness is not a costume to wear when we want to seem interesting. It's a state that some people are desperately trying to survive. And from here, as the noise begins to quiet, we must move forward, not with mockery but with mercy, not with performance, but with presence. Because in the next moment, in the next screen someone swipes past, a person might be reaching out not for a meme, but for meaning. And what we choose to show them might just matter more than we know. And now we arrive at perhaps one of the most dangerous byproducts of the trendification of mental health, the spread of medical misinformation under the illusion of relatability. In a time where a 30-second clip can influence millions, we've handed over the narrative of psychiatric illness to algorithms and aesthetics. It's no longer doctors diagnosing, it's hashtags. Suddenly, everyone on your For You page has borderline personality disorder, ADHD, trauma, or high-functioning depression. And no one's asking how they know, no one's asking if it's true. We're watching mental illness be recited like horoscopes, picked up, worn for the day, and then passed on once it doesn't fit the current aesthetic anymore. This is the point where curiosity becomes carelessness, where education is replaced by assumption, because we've let simplified versions of these disorders circulate, detached from their true psychological weight. People begin to claim symptoms they barely understand, labeling every mood swing as bipolar, every distraction as ADHD, every bad day as major depressive disorder. And when we reduce these deeply complex conditions into punchy summaries on a vertical screen, we don't educate people, we mislead them, massively, subtly, repeatedly. There's something insidious about watching a disorder become a trend template. These slick, animated infographics and relatable, POV videos aren't raising awareness, they're building echo chambers, where real sufferers become background noise, echo chambers where someone reads one list of symptoms and thinks, oh that's me, without any regard for clinical context, duration, impairment or history. These are the things professionals study for years to learn how to assess, and yet online, we're taught to self-diagnose in under a minute. We have begun to confuse exposure with expertise, and that's hurting people in silence, because every time someone falsely claims a diagnosis, it chips away at the legitimacy of those who are genuinely struggling. It creates a world where a person might hesitate to seek help, afraid they won't be taken seriously, afraid they'll be seen as someone chasing a label, not surviving one. This is how stigma evolves, not just through silence anymore, but through saturation. And still no one seems to question it, because it all looks so well-intentioned. The soft colors, the calming music, the whisper-toned narrations. It feels like care, but care without truth is still a lie. And those lies, repeated often enough, turn into cultural assumptions, like the belief that depression always looks sad, that anxiety is just overthinking, that trauma is trendy, that therapy is a cute life hack. These distortions slowly erode our collective ability to tell the real from the rehearsed. But it doesn't have to be this way. There is a better path, one rooted in honesty, one that values genuine pain over projected aesthetics. We can begin to hold space for real complexity again. We can teach that mental illness isn't pretty, isn't always presentable, and definitely isn't something you can understand just by watching someone cry on camera. Mental illness is missed calls, it's guilt for existing, it's sitting in silence, because you don't even know how to ask for help. It's forgetting what joy feels like, not for a day, but for months, and sometimes for years. It's not poetic, it's not cinematic, it's raw, chaotic, uncaptionable. When we allow misinformation to lead, we aren't just misleading others, we're misleading ourselves into thinking we're raising awareness, when in reality, we're raising noise. And awareness is not noise, it's clarity, it's science, it's lived experience. It's humble enough to admit what it doesn't know, and respectful enough to protect the truths of those who do. That's where the shift needs to happen. That's the kind of integrity we need to bring back into the conversation, because when someone suffering watches others claim their pain with ease, with celebration, with applause, they feel even more invisible. They wonder why their reality isn't accepted with the same compassion. They wonder if their pain is even real. And so, the very people we were meant to uplift get pushed further into silence, into shame, into the background of their own movement. But here's the truth that cuts through all of it. Real mental illness doesn't crave an audience. It craves understanding. It craves care that isn't conditional on how pretty or palatable the pain is. And it deserves a culture that doesn't reward fabrication over authenticity. Let us now begin to tell the truth, even when it's less viral. Let us build a world where knowledge is verified, not vibed, where support doesn't depend on aesthetics, but on action, where the people who are truly fighting silent battles don't have to compete with curated suffering just to be heard. Because when we center truth, we begin to make space again for those who need it most. And space, that quiet, dignified, unseen space, is where true healing begins. When we casually throw around words like depressed, traumatized, or anxious to describe fleeting discomfort, we're not just exaggerating, we're slowly and silently eroding the very language that was built to protect those in pain. Words matter. They aren't just sounds or captions. They are containers of meaning, of experience, of truth. And when we empty those containers by using them carelessly, we rob the people who need them most of the ability to describe what they're going through. There was a time when saying, "I'm depressed," meant something deep, something heavy, something real. Now it often floats around in casual conversations, captioned beneath a sad selfie, or said offhandedly, after a bad test score, or a lonely weekend. But clinical depression is not a mood swing, it's not an aesthetic, it's not a punchline, or a quirky personality trait. It's a condition, a war zone, within the mind. And every time we water that down, we make it harder for someone who is genuinely suffering to say, "This is happening to me," and be believed. Imagine trying to cry for help in a room where everyone's already pretending to scream. That's what it's starting to feel like for many who live with real mental health struggles. They reach for the words that once promised to hold them, and find those words stretched too thin, worn out by repetition, emptied by misuse. It's like being stranded in a storm with a broken radio. You speak, but the signal is lost in the static. And this isn't just about semantics. It's about survival. Language is the first bridge between the invisible world inside us and the visible world around us. When we can't name what's happening to us, we can't ask for the right help, we can't advocate, we can't heal. And when society starts to doubt the weight of those words because they've been used too loosely, those who carry them for real are forced to either shout louder or suffer in silence. Neither is fair. This collapse of language has consequences. It's subtle but deeply damaging. Schools, workplaces, and even support systems start developing a skeptical ear. They start to wonder, is this real, or is this performative? And that hesitation, that pause of disbelief, can cost someone their chance at intervention. We live in a time where we're told to speak up, to destigmatize, to reach out. But when the language of struggle has been turned into a social tool, even the act of asking for help becomes a minefield. No one wants to be the boy who cried wolf, or the girl who posted one too many breakdown TikToks and lost credibility. That's not to say people shouldn't express themselves. They absolutely should. Vulnerability is powerful, but we must begin to differentiate between vulnerability and viral performance, because when the latter becomes the norm, the former begins to look suspicious, and that suspicion hurts the very people who are already fighting to be seen. It creates a culture where authenticity is questioned, where even the ones bleeding quietly are forced to prove they're not just following a trend. But here's the thing, healing starts with honesty, not just with others, but with ourselves. If we feel down, it's okay to say we're sad. If we're stressed, it's okay to say we're overwhelmed. But let's preserve the sanctity of the language that belongs to real suffering. Let's not decorate our discomfort with diagnostic labels just because it makes us feel deeper, more interesting, or more relatable. Because the ones who truly bear those diagnoses don't have the luxury of turning them on and off. Their suffering doesn't clock out when the camera does. So in a world increasingly obsessed with relatability, what if we chose clarity instead? What if we let ourselves be honest about what we are actually feeling? Not what sounds more dramatic, not what garners more attention, but what's true. Because in doing that, we not only respect our own experience, we protect the language that others rely on to survive theirs. And when we do speak those heavy words, "I'm depressed," "I'm struggling," "I need help," let them mean something again. Let them be sacred. Let them carry the weight they were designed to carry, so the next person who says them isn't met with doubt, but with open arms and a listening heart. Because the goal was never to silence people, it's to restore meaning, it's to hold space, not just for expression, but for truth. The kind of truth that doesn't always fit into trends, the kind of truth that doesn't need a filter, the kind of truth that hurts and heals. And maybe, just maybe, when we relearn how to use our words with care, we'll also remember how to listen to the quiet ones, the ones who don't say much but are carrying everything. False narratives don't float quietly. They ripple. They echo into rooms they were never meant to reach. They plant seeds of doubt in minds that once held empathy. And slowly, even the most well-meaning eyes start to narrow. Are you really depressed? Are you just tired? Or are you just looking for attention like everyone else? This skepticism is not born from malice. It is the consequence of a culture that has seen too many masks worn in place of wounds, and the people who bleed in silence are now asked to prove their pain. That's the damage. That's the fracture. Not just in trust, but in safety. What happens when the boy who cried wolf lives in all our timelines, and the real wolf finally shows up? Who listens then? How do you explain to someone that your chest feels like it's collapsing for no reason? That smiling hurts more than staying in bed. That brushing your teeth feels like a mountain you can't climb. Because someone else already said that, exaggerated it, performed it, and called it content. And now, when you say it with sincerity, it sounds recycled. We live in an age where words spread faster than truth. When someone casually claims they're so depressed because their favorite coffee shop closed or because they had 2 deadlines in 1 week, they don't see the harm, but that casualness chips away at credibility. It makes a clinical condition sound like a mild inconvenience. And that reshaping of severity has consequences. Teachers start doubting students who ask for extensions. Employers question sick days. Friends stop checking in. They've heard it too often from too many people, for it to still feel real. This is how false narratives turn into real barriers. They build walls between people and the help they desperately need. The average person already struggles to articulate their pain, to admit it even to themselves. But when they finally do, and they are met with suspicion instead of support, the silence thickens. It reinforces that quiet shame that mental illness already carries. And this shame festers in darkness. In this culture of skepticism, we have unintentionally conditioned ourselves to require evidence for emotional suffering. But how do you prove depression? There are no visible wounds, no lab reports that scream emergency. Depression is measured in missing texts, in skipped showers, in disappearing from conversations, not from malice, but from sheer exhaustion. But when the world sees emotional pain as a performance, genuine behaviors are mislabeled as dramatic or manipulative. Oh, it should never be this hard to be believed. But the online world has made it easier to perform than to feel. And people have learned that playing broken gets more applause than quietly healing. That's what's tragic. The platform rewards spectacle. The loudest pain gets heard, even if it's hollow. And in that noise, the quiet cries, the real ones, get lost. What we have created is a vacuum of distrust. A space where those who suffer are hesitant to speak up, because they don't want to be lumped in with those who faked it. This is not just unfair, it's cruel. Imagine being in a burning building, and being afraid to scream for help because others have pretended their houses were on fire for views. This narrative doesn't just hurt individuals, it weakens the foundation of mental health advocacy. The more we normalize pretending, the more we delegitimize the real. And every time someone falsely claims depression for pity, for popularity, for clicks or comfort, they siphon away belief from someone who actually needs it. They don't just hurt themselves, they take up space in a conversation that was never meant for them. And yet, in all of this, those who are truly struggling continue, quietly, bravely. They get up when getting up feels impossible. They mask their pain not to seek attention, but to avoid burdening anyone else. They are the ones we rarely see, because they are too tired to perform their sadness. Their pain is not curated for sympathy, it is endured in silence. These are the people we must protect. Not just with awareness days and pretty quotes, but with real, raw listening, with belief. With spaces where pain doesn't need to be theatrical to be valid, where someone can say I'm not okay, and not be interrogated for proof. And so the call is not just to the fakers to stop, but to the rest of us to pay closer attention, to understand the difference between visibility and vulnerability, to recognize that depression doesn't always have an audience. It often hides behind polite texts, behind "I'm fines," behind quiet withdrawals from things once loved. If we're going to heal as a society, we need to get better at hearing what isn't shouted, at noticing the absences, at valuing the person too tired to post, too scared to speak, but still trying day after day to hold on. And in those moments when doubt creeps in, choose belief. Choose to see the unseen, because that single thread of trust might be the only lifeline someone is holding on to. But the conversation starts to change when sadness becomes a strategy. When pain is paraded not to be understood, but to be consumed. We now live in a world where vulnerability is a currency, and too often, it's spent carelessly. There's a growing number of people who've discovered that tears trend, that if you speak softly enough, wear the right shade of numbness, and say just enough to sound broken, but never too much to sound clinical, people will listen. Brands will notice. Followers will increase. This is the silent transaction that's reshaping what it means to talk about mental health in the digital age. And the thing is, it's not always obvious. It's not always loud or deliberately manipulative. Sometimes it looks like over-documenting personal breakdowns. Sometimes it's aesthetic reels with tear filters and melancholic captions. It's not that people aren't hurting, but when sadness becomes stylized, when it's treated like a tool to grow engagement, it loses its sacredness. Grief isn't meant to be edited. Depression isn't meant to be uploaded at golden hour. These are human experiences, raw, messy, sacred, and when we package them, when we reframe them as branding tools, we risk turning the pain of others into background noise. The danger in this isn't just the dishonesty, it's the precedent it sets. Young minds watch this unfold online and begin to believe that emotional chaos equals identity, that to be noticed, you must be undone, and not just undone, but visibly, dramatically, photogenically so. They learn, slowly and quietly, that their value rises when their mental health declines, or at least appears to, so they begin to blur the lines. Am I actually unwell, or do I just feel unseen? Is this sadness mine, or am I performing it because no one listened when I was neutral? Because the algorithm doesn't reward peace, it rewards crisis, and eventually you start manufacturing it, not because you're evil or attention-seeking, but because the culture taught you that that's the language that works. The deeper tragedy here is what it does to those who are truly suffering. When pain becomes a performance, the audience becomes desensitized. The person with clinical depression who's silently begging for help starts to sound like the boy who cried wolf. Is this real? Becomes the default reaction. And worse, resources become spread thin. Support systems get tired. Listeners start withdrawing. Mental health becomes background static. And the person who's truly drowning starts believing no one believes them anymore. This culture of clout seeking through emotional pain doesn't just misrepresent mental health, it distorts the very reason we started talking about it in the first place. The original goal was connection, not conversion. It was safety, not stardom. And somewhere along the way, that goal got swallowed by likes and shares. Awareness turned into aesthetic. Advocacy turned into identity cosplay. And now we're surrounded by people who speak the language of the broken, without ever knowing what it means to be shattered. But here's the truth. You don't need to be in crisis to matter. You don't have to bleed publicly to belong. You can exist in joy, in balance, in neutrality, and still be powerful, still be valid. We need to start honoring people who choose to heal privately, just as much as we do those who speak openly, because real strength isn't always visible, and real pain doesn't always need a platform. In fact, the most powerful people in the mental health space are often the quiet ones, the ones who show up daily, despite the weight, the ones who don't post about it, but survive it, who don't monetize their breakdowns but work through them in silence. These people are the true backbone of the movement. Their stories don't trend, but they are the reason this conversation ever had weight. So when we talk about reclaiming the mental health narrative, we're not gatekeeping, we're protecting something sacred. We're making sure that people who truly can't breathe aren't silenced by the ones who cry wolf for applause. This isn't about shaming anyone, it's about asking for integrity, asking for truth. Because mental health isn't a marketing strategy, it's a fight. For many, it's life or death. And the more we treat it like performance, the further we move from its purpose. There's a kind of rebellion in choosing authenticity today, a kind of quiet resistance in saying, I don't want attention, I want healing. That's the shift we need. A space where being okay is celebrated, where neutrality is enough, where not everything needs to be documented for it to be valid. Because the less we perform pain, the more space we make for real healing, the more we step back from the spotlight, the more we allow others to step forward for help. Not every story needs to be seen. Some deserve to be held. Some should live in journals, not timelines. Some wounds should be treated in privacy, not posted for praise. And when we start honoring that boundary again, when we stop measuring worth by suffering, we'll begin to rebuild the credibility this conversation so desperately needs. The truth deserves that. The broken deserve that. And the next generation, who's watching all of us, deserves nothing less than honesty. When real depression shows up, it doesn't always knock. It often arrives quietly, wearing the same clothes as yesterday, speaking less, sleeping more, or sometimes not at all. It doesn't post about itself. It doesn't announce, "Here I am, come save me." Real depression doesn't seek attention. It fears it. And in a world obsessed with declarations, those who suffer in silence are the ones who start to feel the most invisible. It's a strange paradox, how someone can be surrounded by mental health hashtags, awareness months, and wellness influencers, yet still feel like no one truly sees them. That's the loneliness of the truly ill. It's not just isolation from people, it's isolation from meaning, from hope, from a world that now mistakes your suffering as just another performance. And when pain becomes contempt, silence feels like failure. But for many, that silence isn't a choice. It's the only way they've learned to survive. The tragedy deepens when the very platforms that claim to amplify awareness begin to curate sadness into an aesthetic. Real depression doesn't sparkle. It doesn't have perfect lighting. It doesn't fit into a 15-second story. It's not poetic. It's terrifying. It's disorienting. And when people scroll through endless posts about feeling low, accompanied by flawless selfies or brand partnerships, they begin to question the legitimacy of their own experience. Am I even depressed? Do I not look the part? Do I not sound poetic enough? This erosion of authenticity doesn't just hurt, it wounds the foundation of trust that makes healing possible. Because the truly depressed aren't looking for likes, they're looking for light. They're looking for light. They're reaching for something, anything that might pull them back from the abyss. But in the culture we've created, their darkness is often dismissed as too quiet, too inconvenient, too real, and so they shrink even further, until eventually, they stop reaching at all. What happens when someone who's genuinely struggling begins to feel like a fraud in their own pain? When they watch others perform a sadness that garners applause while their own suffering is met with silence or suspicion, they don't get louder, they get smaller. They begin to apologize for taking up space. They start masking even more. And this quiet retreat is what we must fear most. Not the shouts of those pretending, but the silencing of those surviving. We've created a space where loud sadness is validated, and quiet survival is ignored. Where mental illness becomes a brand, and real symptoms get filtered out. And while this might seem harmless to some, what's the harm in people expressing themselves? The truth is, this false equivalence has consequences. When performance overshadows reality, the sick start to feel out of place in their own narrative. There's a unique pain in realizing the world only sees your illness when it's polished, that you must package your trauma to make it palatable. But depression isn't a digestible story. It's messy. It's inconsistent. It doesn't follow a linear arc. One day you're okay enough to work. The next you can't even shower. And yet, because it doesn't fit the curated mold of how society now expects mental illness to appear, your experience is dismissed. The more we reward performative pain, the more we push genuine pain underground. The more we cheer for the drama, the more we ignore the people quietly fighting for breath beneath it all. And so, in a world where suffering has been turned into a showcase, the ones who suffer most are left unseen, not because they aren't trying, but because they refuse to turn their illness into a display. And that refusal, that quiet dignity, it's not weakness, it's strength. Because it takes courage to survive without applause. It takes strength to keep going without validation. And that's what makes the loneliness so cruel, because those who are strongest are often the ones we forget to check on. Not because we don't care, but because we've been taught that pain is loud, when in fact it often whispers. So if you're listening to this, and you're one of the quiet ones, the ones who carry the weight in silence, know this: you are seen. Even when the world scrolls past your struggle, even when you feel invisible in the noise, your pain is valid. Your effort matters. You do not need to perform to be believed. Because healing isn't a spectacle, it's sacred. It's not something we owe to an audience. It's something we owe to ourselves. And in that silent space where no one claps and no one watches, something powerful happens. You begin to reclaim your narrative, not for sympathy, not for approval, but for survival, and that above all, is what deserves the loudest standing ovation of all. But the narrative doesn't have to stay hijacked. The moment we begin to recognize the difference between expression and exploitation, we reclaim the power that has quietly been diluted. Mental health is not a content strategy, not a filter, not a mood for likes and comments. It is a reality lived in quiet mornings where someone barely finds the energy to get out of bed. It's not the dramatic text post or the moody aesthetic. It's the emptiness behind the eyes that no caption can quite capture. And in this overwhelming wave of noise, false claims, dramatized stories, and curated breakdowns, the truth still exists, waiting patiently to be heard again. We shift the narrative by remembering where it came from. Mental health awareness wasn't born on social media. It was carved into existence by people who were silenced for centuries. People institutionalized, dismissed, mocked, ignored. The voices that now echo through wellness campaigns were once whispers in psychiatric wards, battles fought in isolation, in families who didn't believe, in communities that labeled them weak. And now that we finally have a language for these things, it's being misused. When sadness is mistaken for depression, when anxiety becomes a personality quirk, we abandon the very people who fought for these words to matter. Reclaiming the conversation begins in honesty. It starts in how we describe our feelings, not for aesthetic impact but for internal clarity. When we say we're depressed, do we mean the clinical weight of it, or do we mean we're tired, disappointed, bored? Language is not a trend, it's a tool, and we owe it to ourselves, and to others, to use it responsibly. There is no shame in simply feeling off, but there is danger in dramatizing every emotional discomfort as disorder, because in doing so, we teach the world to roll its eyes when someone is truly in pain. This shift isn't about canceling anyone or calling people out. It's about calling people back to the core of this movement. You don't need to fake a mental illness to be part of the mental health conversation. You don't have to perform brokenness to stand in solidarity with the broken. Compassion doesn't require a costume. You can say, I care about people with depression without pretending to be one. That is powerful, that is pure, and that is what the movement truly needs. Real support, not borrowed trauma. Because while fake stories gather engagement, real ones often suffer in silence. The ones who are truly battling don't have the energy to turn their pain into a post. They're not thinking about color schemes or hashtags. They're trying to breathe, and it's not fair that their suffering is overshadowed by someone else's performance. It's not fair that their cries are questioned because the loudest voices weren't telling the truth. It's not fair that they have to prove their pain. So we shift it back, not with anger, but with accuracy. Not with judgment, but with discernment. We bring truth back into the center, gently, intentionally, and with reverence. We make space for quiet suffering to be heard again. We listen for the subtle signals, the things people don't post, the cancelled plans, the long silences, the emotional numbness, the slow fading of joy, and we stop treating mental illness as something that must always look dramatic to be valid. Sometimes it's just silence, sometimes it's just stillness, and sometimes it's everything all at once, but hidden behind a practiced smile. We also begin to notice ourselves. Are we contributing to the noise, or cutting through it? Are we adding clarity, or confusion? It takes strength to pause and ask, am I being truthful? There is no shame in feeling heavy, but there is deep, necessary strength in choosing to name it accurately, and when we do, we clear the air for others. We make space for people to be real, even if that realness doesn't get clicks, because this is bigger than social media. This is about how we build culture. When false stories become viral, they also become policy blind spots. They affect how doctors are trained, how schools approach mental health, how governments allocate funding. Performative pain skews perception, and perception shapes response. If the world only sees one version of depression, it will only build systems to address that version, and everyone else, everyone who doesn't fit the mold, will be left unseen, unsupported, and unheard. The shift we're talking about isn't dramatic, it's not glamorous, it's quiet, it's a choice, a decision to speak more truthfully, to listen more patiently, to stop rewarding fake vulnerability and start respecting real struggle. It's not about silencing anyone, it's about elevating the ones who've been drowned out, the ones who don't know how to make their story go viral, because they're too busy trying to survive it. This is where integrity matters more than identity, where your intentions matter more than your image, where being well informed is more valuable than being well liked. When you choose truth, Even when it's less interesting, you create safety for someone else to do the same. So shift it. One word at a time, one conversation at a time. Let the truth be heavier than the trend. Let it weigh enough to make people pause, and in that pause, maybe finally, someone who's been hurting will feel seen. We are living in a time where healing itself has been reduced to a highlight reel. On platforms meant to connect us, we've instead learned how to curate ourselves. We've turned the pain of recovery into a mood board. Soft lighting, filtered tears, a caption with just the right balance of vulnerability and poise. And slowly the idea of healing has become another performance, another aesthetic meant not to reflect truth, but to fit into a grid. But healing isn't photogenic. It doesn't always fit within the square confines of an Instagram post. It's rarely linear, often unshareable, and deeply personal. It's sobbing without knowing why. It's unwashed hair and dishes in the sink because you just couldn't find the energy. It's getting out of bed one day, only to feel like you've failed again the next. But none of that gets posted, does it? The moments that matter most in healing are too raw to be edited, too messy to be liked. The danger isn't just that healing has been made into a brand. The deeper harm is that so many are now measuring their progress by someone else's carefully polished portrayal. You see someone post, "Healing is beautiful," and you wonder, why isn't mine? You question your own journey. You begin to think you're doing it wrong just because it doesn't look like hers or his or theirs. But the truth is, real healing doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like survival, sometimes it looks like nothing at all, and yet we're told over and over again, just post about your struggle, let it out. But what we're really being asked for is a version of pain that's palatable, one that's brief, stylized and digestible, one that makes others feel good for supporting you but never asks them to stay when it gets too real. That's not community, that's a theater of empathy, and it's shallow. We must remind ourselves the most sacred parts of growth often happen in silence. Not everything needs to be turned outward. You are not required to display your hurt for it to be valid. You don't need likes to confirm your healing. The moment you chose to keep going, even when it didn't feel worth it, that was enough. That was real. That was yours. But the illusion goes deeper. Social media rewards quick progress, not honest process. A photo before and after. Where's the during? The nights you couldn't sleep, the therapy sessions you dreaded, the conversations you had to revisit 100 times in your head before you could let go. That during is where the transformation lives. But no one posts that, because the internet isn't built to hold slow pain. It's built to reward fast feelings. So we begin to mimic what we see. We start performing our recovery, not living it. We quote trauma in clean fonts. We talk about inner peace while still hiding from our own minds. We preach self-care but haven't rested in weeks. There is a growing gap between how we portray our healing and how we actually feel inside. And in that gap, authenticity suffocates. This is where we must shift. Healing isn't a story you tell to prove something. It's not a timeline you share to gain applause. It is a daily practice, quiet, stubborn and deeply unglamorous. It's choosing yourself without needing anyone to notice. It's falling apart and putting yourself back together again, not for an audience but for your own survival. We need to give people permission to heal without performance, to recover without recording, to grow without showcasing. When someone says they're healing, we need to stop expecting a narrative arc, a visible transformation, a poetic conclusion. Healing doesn't always come with closure. Sometimes it's just a continuation. But most importantly, we must return to integrity. Integrity in how we speak about ourselves. Integrity in how we support others. Integrity in how we define and engage with the mental health journey. You don't need to prove that you're okay to be okay. You don't need to look strong to be strong. And you certainly don't need to post your progress to prove it's happening. Real healing is invisible. It's the boundaries you set, the calls you didn't return, the party you skipped, the trigger you learned to walk away from. None of it looks good on camera. All of it matters. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the most powerful healing isn't the kind that gets noticed. Maybe it's the kind that quietly restores you while no one's watching. Maybe healing is not something to be seen, but something to be felt, lived and protected. Not marketed, but respected. Not cropped and captioned, but carried through the small decisions you make in private. Because at the end of it all, healing is not content. Healing is commitment. If you tell the world you're struggling, be honest. Not loud, not dramatic, not rehearsed, just honest. That's all that's ever truly needed, because the world is already listening, aching to hear something real. People don't crave spectacle, They crave something that echoes the things they've been too afraid to say aloud. But honesty has become a rare currency in a digital landscape addicted to performance. We are shaping entire narratives about mental health in real time, every time we speak about our pain online, and that comes with responsibility. This isn't about silencing people, it's about asking that when you do speak, you mean it. When you post about depression, make sure it's not for aesthetic sympathy. When you describe anxiety, don't recycle phrases you've seen trending. The stories we tell become part of the cultural vocabulary. They inform how our friends respond to someone crying in silence. They teach teachers, employers, even parents, how to interpret a breakdown. And if those stories are skewed, if they're exaggerated, curated, or fake, then they become scripts others are expected to follow, scripts that were never written by those who suffer in silence. Real people are navigating this storm every day without applause. They're in therapy they can't afford. They're sitting in classrooms with spiraling thoughts no one sees. They're going to work while mentally unraveling, trying not to fall apart on the bus ride home. When you're not one of them, but speak as if you are, you unintentionally rewrite their experience. You redefine what depression looks like for people who've never known it firsthand. And what happens then, when someone truly broken asks for help, but doesn't fit the performance template society has learned from performative storytelling? They get dismissed. They're told it doesn't look that bad, that they should just go outside more, that they're just being dramatic. The real pain becomes the unheard pain. That's why honesty matters. That's why accountability in the way we tell our mental health stories is sacred, because one false narrative can close 100 doors for the people genuinely trying to knock. You don't need to embellish your experience to be relevant. You don't need to invent wounds to be visible. There is no badge of honor in pain. There is nothing glamorous about barely surviving. And yet the internet has given it a filter, a soundtrack, a fan base. But curated despair doesn't heal. It misleads. It confuses. It numbs us all to what matters most. Compassion grounded in truth. Responsibility doesn't mean perfection. It means intention. Speak with the intention to help, not to harvest attention. Post with the goal of being real, not being relatable, because the difference matters. One brings comfort, the other brings confusion. When we allow false mental health stories to go unchecked, we plant doubt in the minds of everyone. Doubt in whether depression is real, doubt in whether someone is actually suffering, doubt in whether asking for help is just attention seeking. That doubt doesn't just hurt feelings, it kills conversations, it kills trust, it kills access to empathy. You see, people are watching, not just followers or strangers online, but people on the edge, people wondering if their darkness is valid, if their feelings are allowed to exist, if healing is even worth pursuing. When they see others treating mental illness like a costume, a brand or a marketing tool, it tells them their pain might be too inconvenient to believe in, and so they retreat further, say less, feel more alone. This is how we lose people, not always physically, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. We lose their belief in being understood. That loss is subtle, but devastating. So if you have a platform, any platform, even just your circle of friends, use it with reverence. You don't have to share everything. You don't have to be vulnerable all the time. But if you choose to step into that space, step in fully, not performatively, not conveniently, but fully, truthfully, and respectfully. It's easy to forget that we shape culture one sentence at a time, that the things we normalize now become the assumptions of tomorrow. But the reality is, we are cultural architects. With every caption, every story, every video, we're building the collective understanding of what mental health means. And if we build it on shaky ground, those who need to stand on it will fall right through. If you've never felt the depth of real mental collapse, don't pretend to know it, but do stand beside those who do. You don't need to become the voice of the movement to be its supporter. You don't need to create pain to create impact. Empathy can be shown through listening, through making space, through not centering yourself in an experience that isn't yours. This is the moment to shift, to stop letting hashtags lead the conversation, and let humanity lead it instead. It's the moment to step back and ask, who is this helping? Who is this hurting? And what will this teach the next person who's genuinely afraid to speak? The world needs more silence before speech, more reflection before reaction, and above all, more truth before performance. Because when it comes to mental health, the truth doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. It just needs to be real. You don't have to wear pain to walk beside it. You don't need to bleed to help someone heal. And yet, too many people feel the need to hijack a narrative, they don't truly belong to just to feel close to a cause. But real help, meaningful, grounded, lasting help, doesn't begin with imitation. It begins with witnessing, with listening, with restraint. There is a profound strength in standing next to someone without making their pain about you. In a world obsessed with centering the self, there's something quietly revolutionary about remaining off stage, because true allies in the fight for mental health are not always the loudest ones. They're the ones who hold the silence so others can speak. And still we find ourselves in a cultural storm where the line between empathy and mimicry is blurring. It begins subtly. A person hears a story of struggle, and suddenly they recall a moment of sadness. They feel the pull to relate, to share, to be seen, and in trying to be part of that pain, they begin to reshape their own narrative to fit. They wear the symptoms like borrowed clothes, not because they want to lie, but because the world now celebrates the appearance of struggle more than the effort to relieve it. And so we create a mirror hall of half-truths and dramatized darkness, where the original voice becomes lost in the echo. But you don't need to echo suffering to validate it. You can acknowledge pain without replicating it. You can support someone's truth without writing yourself into their story. That's not exclusion, it's respect. And in a time when social media thrives on personal branding, there is immense courage in choosing to uplift someone else's truth without hijacking it for your own spotlight. What does that look like in practice? It's resisting the urge to post a cryptic "I relate" caption when you don't. It's choosing to share resources instead of selfies. It's understanding that sometimes the most powerful form of support is invisible, because those truly hurting aren't always broadcasting it. And those who want to help shouldn't need applause to do it. When you feign pain to participate in advocacy, you don't just blur your own boundaries, you also make it harder for others to be believed. You help fuel a world where real stories are met with skepticism, where cries for help are seen as strategy, where mental health becomes theater, and every fake monologue makes it harder for someone else to deliver their first honest line. But if you truly want to help, the path is clearer than you think. Start by asking yourself, is this moment about me, or about them? Center their need, not your narrative. Instead of claiming their symptoms, amplify their voice. Instead of posting your proximity to their struggle, educate yourself. Learn the language of empathy, without appropriation. Learn how to stand near pain without absorbing it performatively. The truth is, helping someone with mental illness often doesn't look poetic or shareable. It looks like showing up when the texts go unanswered. It looks like patience. It looks like not needing credit. And for many it looks like staying quiet, so that someone else's voice can finally break through. In real movements we don't need more false prophets of pain. We need anchors. We need those who don't crumble under the weight of a story they never had to carry. We need clarity in a conversation that has grown murky with oversharing and self-branding, because there is an entire generation growing up online now, learning about mental health through aesthetics, watching others perform depression, watching the applause, and what do they take away? That suffering is a currency, that trauma is a pass to attention, that unless you're broken you're invisible, and that is a tragedy we can stop. We can rewrite this quietly, steadily, authentically, with actions not personas, with listening, not spotlight stealing, with the refusal to fake what others are fighting. We can hold the door open instead of stepping in front of it, and when someone finally steps through it, trembling, unsure, raw, we can be there, not as actors playing the same role, but as witnesses, friends, protectors of the truth. Because maybe the next part of the conversation isn't just about who's hurting, but who's hurting alone, not because no one sees them, but because too many are pretending to. And maybe the bravest thing we can do now is to stop trying to wear their pain and start building a world where they no longer have to carry it alone. And in that stillness, in that honest refusal to pretend, something powerful begins to shift. The spotlight moves, quietly, away from performance toward truth. But the damage doesn't stop with performance. The slow corrosion happens underneath, in the minds of those who are truly suffering, who begin to doubt their own experience. When someone watches the world applaud another's carefully curated version of sadness, they start to wonder, am I even allowed to call this depression anymore, if I'm not crying into a camera? Is my struggle valid if it doesn't look poetic? This is the invisible erosion of inner trust. When everyone's speaking the language of mental illness, fluently and fluently falsely, the native speakers go silent, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. It's a brutal thing to begin questioning your own pain. You wake up struggling, but you see someone else smiling through it with makeup, hashtags, and a ring light. And instead of feeling understood, you feel smaller. more broken, less legitimate. The fakes don't just steal the microphone, they adjust the pitch of the entire conversation, until real sufferers no longer recognize their own voice in the crowd. That's the betrayal. Mental health doesn't always announce itself with words. It's not always aesthetic, or linear, or something you can frame into a neat narrative. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's nothing but survival. And when the world begins expecting your depression to look like someone else's performance, it rewires your brain to discredit your own hurt. It says, "You don't seem depressed enough. You're not broken in the right way," and that seed of doubt grows into a full-blown internal mutiny. This is where the rot starts to spread, not in the public eye, but in the quiet, private moments where someone chooses not to reach out because they think they're not sick enough, not sad enough, not aesthetic enough to be taken seriously. When we normalize falsified pain and dramatized symptoms, we simultaneously delegitimize the raw, unedited reality of true mental illness. And then the ones who actually need help start to whisper instead of speak. They start to minimize. They start to hide. We've reached a strange intersection, one where awareness campaigns have turned into trends, where vulnerability is algorithmic, where mental health is a keyword as much as a condition. And in the middle of that noisy digital stage, the genuinely suffering stand at the edge, unseen, not because they're too quiet, but because the volume of pretense is drowning out everything else. What if we started to hold space differently? What if instead of asking people to prove their pain, we trusted it when it came? What if we stopped holding up performative sadness as the standard, and began listening for the kinds of suffering that don't fit into captions or 60-second reels? True mental health advocacy must begin by protecting the dignity of real pain, not performing it, not mocking it through mimicry, but making room for its full, complex, often invisible shape. Because if we continue demanding that people present their struggles in a way that suits our expectations, loud, dramatic, aesthetic, we are no longer inviting them to heal, we are coercing them into conformity. And healing never begins with pressure, it begins with permission. When a person who is genuinely unwell begins comparing their suffering to someone else's curated breakdown, it doesn't motivate them to get better, it makes them feel like they're failing at even being sick. And that shame is poisonous. It makes them shrink from the very support they need. They think, maybe I don't deserve therapy, maybe I'm just weak, maybe I'm just seeking attention. And suddenly they begin carrying not only the weight of depression, but the burden of disbelieving their own condition. It becomes a prison inside a fog. We have to remember that mental illness does not owe anyone a spectacle. Some people smile through it. Some people smile through it. Some people cry quietly. Some people isolate. Some people overcompensate. There is no singular photogenic version of depression or anxiety or trauma. The moment we begin demanding that people present their wounds in a way that matches our assumptions, we invalidate the very thing we claim to care about. This is the cultural wound. This is where we must place the healing hand, not just on the individuals pretending, but on the systems that reward them more than they support the authentic, on the culture that turned pain into a trend, on the followers and comment sections and applause that reinforce that if your sadness is beautiful, it's more believable. But real healing starts in stillness. It starts when we begin believing the quiet cries, not just the loud ones. When we validate the messy, confusing, unfiltered truth of mental health. When we stop using language like "everyone's depressed now" with eye rolls and start asking better questions. We're not in a crisis because too many people are sad. We're in a crisis because the truly sad no longer know if they're allowed to be taken seriously, because their symptoms have been turned into a costume, and so we return to the essence of presence. The type that doesn't need a caption, the kind that notices without needing to name, the presence that sits beside real pain without expecting it to pose for the camera, because this is the next revolution to create a culture where the quiet, the unseen, the not pretty pain is believed, and held, and honored, exactly as it is. Somewhere along the way we forgot that being well is a gift, not a guilt. In a world saturated with declarations of sadness, there's almost a quiet shame in admitting you're okay, as if being mentally stable means you're out of touch, as if you're less real, less human, less compassionate. We have overcorrected. The pendulum that swung too long towards silence has now flown too far into theater, and in the process, we have created a new discomfort, one where being mentally healthy feels like betrayal. But peace is not betrayal. Balance is not blindness. We must begin unlearning the toxic narrative that says you must be broken to be deep, unstable to be interesting, or depressed to be accepted. Mental health is not a trend. It is not an aesthetic. It is not something you should need to wear like a badge, just to be seen. It's okay to be okay. It's okay to have clarity, to feel joy, to wake up without dread, to go through a day with no spiral of existential anguish, not because you're numb but because you've healed, or maybe just because you're in a good season. We must start telling each other, telling the world, that wellness is not a threat to empathy, that strength is not indifference, that just because you're not drowning doesn't mean you can't throw someone a rope. There are those who have done the work, who have sat in therapy, who have journaled, prayed, breathed, medicated, suffered in silence and then in expression, and have come through to the other side. There are also those who were lucky, born with brain chemistry that holds steady, with families that listen, with lives that didn't fracture under pressure. These people exist too, and they should not be made to feel like intruders in a conversation about mental health, because real mental health advocacy isn't about glorifying brokenness. It's about creating a world where people no longer have to break. It's about prevention, not just reaction. It's about allowing the healed to stay whole without asking them to refragment themselves for relatability. You should not need to dim your peace just to make others comfortable in their chaos. Compassion doesn't require camouflage, but right now, far too often, it feels like peace must be hidden, like the only way to belong in the conversation is to disclose a wound, to bleed a little, to perform pain even when you're not feeling it. And this harms everyone, not just the healthy, because it reinforces the idea that mental wellness is rare, or suspicious, or fake. It tells those who are trying to recover that they will always be more loved when they're low. We have to break that cycle. We must begin to teach, in schools, in homes, on screens, that being mentally well is not just acceptable, it's admirable, that resilience is not denial, that stability doesn't mean you're cold or shallow, and that not all stories have to be tragic to be true. Because when we make sadness the only valid voice, we erase the possibility of hope, and hope is oxygen. We need people who are doing well to speak up too, not to brag, not to diminish, but to normalize the destination, to show that healing is real, that therapy works, that consistency is possible, that you can move beyond survival and into thriving, and that it's not shameful to say, I'm in a good place right now, because that statement's simple, quiet calm is revolutionary. It disrupts the performative culture that rewards spiraling and overlooks stability. It reminds people that the goal is not just to talk about the fall, but to climb, that we are not meant to live in the valley forever. That wellness too is a story worth sharing. It's not the loudest story. It's not always the one that gets the likes or the comments or the sympathy, but it's real, and it's needed. Especially now, when too many young minds are learning that identity is forged in trauma, that relevance requires anguish, and that peace is boring. They need to see that health can be beautiful, that it can be strong, that it can be enough. Because if we don't show them, the cycle will continue. More pretending, more aestheticized despair, more glamorized instability, more people who feel pressured to invent a pain just to be included, and more people who are actually hurting, being drowned out by the noise of those performing hurt. The narrative must change. It is not just okay to be mentally healthy, it is powerful. It is something to protect, to celebrate, to model. It's how we shift the culture. It's how we remind the world that the purpose of mental health awareness is not to keep us all comfortably wounded, but to make healing possible and visible, so that even the ones who haven't broken yet know they don't have to. So that we stop telling each other, you're only real if you're in pieces, and start saying you are allowed to be whole. And in that shift we find our new responsibility, not to fake the darkness but to be the light. When we stop treating pain as performance, we begin to see it as it is, something real. And once the lights dim on the theatrics of mimicry, we're left with the raw, quiet truth that depression is not an identity to wear like fashion. It is an illness that wears you down slowly from the inside out. It is not something you become to belong. It is something that overtakes you, often without your consent, without your awareness, and certainly without your desire. But the world has started confusing the vocabulary of mental health with the vocabulary of style. Suddenly, people are not just feeling low, they are depressed, not diagnosed, not treated, just self-declared. They build their digital bios around sadness, their humor around disassociation, their personalities around gloom, as if darkness is the most interesting part of them, as if trauma is a badge, and pain is poetic. Yet depression isn't poetic. It isn't quirky. It isn't just feeling down or staying in bed one lazy weekend. It is a chemical, psychological, physiological imbalance. It steals color from the world. It robs people of memory, joy, clarity, function. It clouds thought, warps reality, corrodes hope. It's waking up with no energy to shower, to eat, to speak, and blaming yourself for it. It's smiling at work while crumbling on the inside, because the world demands performance, not honesty. It is not a fashion statement. It is a medical condition. And when people glamorize it, whether to feel unique, to be relatable, or to join a trend, they create a dangerous illusion that depression is common, casual, maybe even cool. But that illusion kills nuance. It takes the extraordinary pain of real sufferers and folds it into aesthetics. And in doing so, it chips away at the credibility of those who are barely surviving. Because when illness becomes identity, treatment becomes treason. People begin to cling to their suffering because it's the only thing that makes them feel seen, the only thing that garners attention. And so they resist healing, not because they don't want it, but because they're afraid of what comes next. Who will they be without their sadness? What will they post? What community will they lose? This is how deeply we've confused affliction with persona. But no one should feel that losing an illness means losing their self. Depression is not your aesthetic. It is not your content pillar. It is not a personality trait. It is a condition that deserves clarity, not cosplay. And to separate from it is not betrayal. It is healing. It is the beginning of remembering who you are when you're not surviving. Imagine a world where we stopped treating mental illness as a character arc and started addressing it with compassion, science, structure, where people no longer perform sadness for validation, but receive care for it without needing to dramatize it, where seeking help is normalized and romanticizing suffering is not. That world begins when we stop saying I am depressed, casually, and start saying I have depression, consciously, if at all. The difference matters. You are not your illness. You are not a collection of symptoms. You are not defined by darkness, even if it sometimes surrounds you. You are still someone beneath it all, someone before the fog, someone worth returning to. But we can't arrive there if depression remains a social brand. We can't move toward wholeness if our culture continues to reward despair. If every breakdown is broadcast, if every spiral is shared for likes, if every cry for help is met with aesthetic edits instead of real intervention, we only deepen the crisis. You were never meant to suffer to be significant. You don't need to be broken to be loved. And you certainly don't need to claim illness to feel relevant. Let depression return to what it is, a condition that needs treatment, not attention. Let it be taken seriously by letting go of the illusion that it's an identity you can try on for the week, or a filter for your mood board. Let the people who are struggling know that they are not invisible, but also not alone. And for those watching, those unsure, those tempted to speak pain into their story just to feel more seen, pause. Ask yourself if your desire to relate is worth muddying the waters others are drowning in. Ask if what you want is visibility, or belonging, or help, and find ways to seek those things without borrowing the language of suffering you do not carry, because you don't need to pretend to be ill to deserve care, and you don't need to wear a diagnosis to be worth something. Or what you need, what we all need, is a world where authenticity isn't a trend, where silence isn't a penalty, and where healing is allowed to happen quietly, privately, truthfully. That begins by letting depression be what it is, so we can begin finally to treat it as it should be. There was a time when being real meant something, when authenticity wasn't a costume you wore for a post, or a pose you practiced in front of a mirror, but a quiet force in your way of living. It was in how you spoke when no one was watching, in how you showed up for others when it wasn't convenient, in how you didn't need to explain your pain to prove it was real. And somewhere along the road, we traded that sacredness for performance. We turned vulnerability into content. We took the rawness of pain and smoothed it into digestible aesthetics. We built whole identities around being broken, even when we weren't. Because in a world that monetizes wounds, who gets rewarded for healing? Who gets seen for being whole? But what if we remembered? What if we chose to make authenticity sacred again? Not glamorous, not curated, not poetic, but sacred. What if we chose to stop performing what we don't feel, and start honoring what we do? Because there is a quiet violence in pretending to suffer for relevance. It dilutes the meaning of real pain. It fractures the clarity we need to recognize it in others. And worst of all, it teaches the next generation that realness is just another aesthetic to adopt. We are living in a time where the line between truth and theatrics is razor thin. People don't just want to be heard, They want to be seen in the exact posture of pain that earns the most sympathy. And when you watch that long enough, something inside you starts to distort. You begin to question yourself. You wonder, am I real enough? Am I suffering enough to matter? And that question shouldn't even exist. Authenticity doesn't ask to be liked. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't dress itself up or down to fit someone's expectations. It just is. That's the power of it. That's what we've lost. We've made honesty something you have to brand, something you have to filter, something you have to prove. But real truth, lived truth, doesn't come with a strategy. It comes with quiet, often uncomfortable clarity, and we need to bring reverence back to that. We need to stop treating authenticity like a performance, and start treating it like a responsibility, because when you walk around wearing someone else's pain, not only do you lose your own center, you steal someone else's stage. You speak over voices that need to be heard. You create confusion. You make honesty harder to spot. And when we can't recognize the real, we fail the ones who need us the most. This isn't just about stopping people from faking. It's about calling people back to themselves. It's about remembering that your worth does not depend on how dramatic your story sounds, or how sad your post is, or how well you perform a symptom. You don't need to fake darkness to be valid. And if you are hurting, you don't need to make it theatrical to deserve care. We are so used to proving we're in pain that we forget we don't have to. The sacredness of your story lies not in how loud it is, but in how true. You don't owe anyone a breakdown. You don't have to bleed in public to be real. Your truth matters even when it's quiet, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't look like someone else's. And that's what we need to rebuild. A world where authenticity doesn't have to compete with performance. Where people don't feel forced to dramatize their emotions to be seen, where we start honoring the slow healing, the invisible battles, the unphotogenic progress, where truth is not glamorized but protected, not sold but safeguarded. We need to create space where being okay is just as allowed as not being okay, where silence is not suspicious, where joy is not ignored, where we can say, "I'm good today," without feeling guilty for not matching the collective sorrow. Because if pain is the only currency that buys us attention, we'll keep hurting ourselves just to be visible. It doesn't have to be that way. We can begin by deplatforming performance and re-platforming presence. We can begin by uplifting the ones who are truly living their truth, even when it's quiet, even when it's raw, even when it's messy. We can begin by looking at ourselves and asking, where have I been honest, and where have I been rehearsing, and then letting go of what isn't ours to carry. There is beauty in being unfinished. There is strength in not knowing. There is wisdom in saying, this is where I am, and I don't need to exaggerate it. That is the soil where real healing grows. Not from dramatized pain, but from radical honesty. Not from curated personas, but from courageous presence. Let's return to that. Let's re-sacralize the real. Let's begin to treat truth not as a trend, but as a discipline. Because in a world starving for depth, the most revolutionary thing you can do is be exactly who you are. No edits, no script, no borrowed suffering, just you. Alive, aware, enough. When the dust of noise settles, when the applause fades and the eyes turn away, what remains? Is it healing, or just a hollow performance? Because at the heart of this entire conversation, beneath the distractions and distortions, lies a single, honest question. Do we actually want people to get better? Or do we want them to stay broken just enough to keep the narrative interesting? This is where we arrive when pain becomes performance, when validation becomes a currency, when the wounded are seen not as people but as characters in an ongoing feed of sympathy and tragedy. Somewhere along the way, the goalpost shifted. Healing stopped being the endgame. Attention became enough. But real healing doesn't look good on camera. It's quiet. It's repetitive. It's full of small, unremarkable moments that never go viral. It doesn't scream for attention. It asks for space, and perhaps that's why it's been sidelined in this culture of visible pain. Because healing asks us to do something much harder than share. It asks us to change. There is something deeply unsettling about a world where people feel more comfortable watching others suffer than supporting them through silence. Where the badge of struggle is worn like a brand, but the hard, unphotogenic work of therapy, boundaries, forgiveness, or medication is ignored because it doesn't entertain. But healing was never meant to entertain. It was meant to liberate. And for those who truly carry the weight of mental illness, healing isn't a one-time post or a beautiful breakdown, it's a daily commitment. It's the moment you drag yourself out of bed when your mind tells you not to. It's the decision to respond to one message, the courage to show up, the effort to reframe a thought, the discipline to stay consistent even when you're not congratulated for it. That's the work, the real work. But when mental health becomes a trend, when we glamorize the pain and hide the process, we teach people to stay in the wound. We offer them applause for breaking down, but silence when they start rebuilding. We give them identity in being damaged, but take it away when they begin to grow, and so they stay, in the pain, in the performance, because that's where the attention lives. And this isn't just sad, it's dangerous, because if we reward pain more than progress, we breed generations who find worth only in their wounds, who believe that unless they are suffering visibly, they are invisible, who associate their identity with illness, and see recovery as a betrayal of the persona they've built. And once that belief takes hold, healing starts to feel like erasure, but healing is not erasure. It's remembrance. It's the quiet reclaiming of who you were before the world told you you had to bleed to be seen. It's not a betrayal of your struggle, it's the reward for surviving it. So what if we shifted this? What if we stopped applauding collapse and started celebrating stability? What if we showed people what recovery really looks like, not as a final glow-up, but as a daily, non-linear, deeply personal journey? What if we made healing aspirational, not shameful? What if we taught people that they are worthy even when they're okay, that being whole is not boring, that peace is not weakness, that you don't need to constantly prove how much you've suffered to matter, because you're allowed to outgrow your pain? You're allowed to move forward, you're allowed to live a life that isn't defined by what hurt you. And maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing left to do is to let go of the performance and choose the path that no one's clapping for, actual, slow, real, unapologetic healing. It won't always get you likes, it won't make you a trending hashtag, but it will set you free. And in that freedom, in that soft rebellion against the need to be seen suffering, you become something rare in this world. Not just someone who talks about mental health, but someone who lives it, someone who carries the quiet power of peace, not loud, not dramatic, not aesthetic, but real, and that is the shift the world actually needs.